The carriage struck a rock on the road, and Alara Whitmore gripped the door handle as her body jolted forward. Outside, rain hammered against the windows, and thunder rolled across the dark sky. She was on her way to a home she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met. Her heart pounded, not with excitement, but with fear of the unknown. Her father had signed the agreement 3 weeks earlier, a debt too large to pay, a name too proud to lose, and a daughter who was the only currency left to offer. Alara did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing changed nothing in her family. She simply packed her belongings, kissed her mother's cold cheek, and stepped into the carriage that would carry her toward Ashcombe Manor. The manor rose out of the mist, like a giant stone creature, its towers sharp against the gray sky. Rows of dark windows stared down at her, and not one candle flickered behind the glass. It was the kind of house that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. A servant opened the door before she could knock. He was an older man with tired eyes and a stiff back, dressed in a black coat that had seen better years. He looked at her with something close to pity. "You must be Lady Whitmore," he said. "The Duke is expecting you. Please, come in, out of the rain." Alara stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a heavy sound, like a chapter ending before it had even begun. The hall was grand but cold, filled with portraits of stern faces and weapons mounted on the walls, remnants of past wars fought by past dukes. She walked past them, feeling their painted eyes follow her every step. At the end of the hall stood a man she recognized instantly, though they had never met. He was tall, with dark hair, and sharper features than any portrait could capture. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and his expression held no warmth at all. "Julian Renshaw," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Duke of Ashcombe." "Alara Whitmore," she replied, taking his hand briefly. It was cold, even through the glove. "You are late," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "The wedding will take place tomorrow morning. My steward will show you to your chambers." That was all. No questions about her journey, no comfort for the storm she had traveled through, no curiosity about the woman who was about to become his wife. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing against the marble floor, leaving her standing alone in the entrance of a home that did not yet feel like home. That night, Alara lay awake in a room that smelled of dust and old wood. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside, and wondered what kind of life waited for her behind the walls of Ashcombe Manor. She thought of her mother's advice before she left. "Marriage is not about love, my dear. It is about survival. Learn to survive, and you will be fine." She repeated those words to herself until sleep finally took her. The wedding was small and quiet, held in the manor's private chapel with only a handful of witnesses. Julian said his vows without looking at her, his voice steady and practiced, as though he had rehearsed indifference his entire life. Alara said hers with a trembling voice, searching his face for any flicker of feeling. She found none. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Julian did not smile. He simply nodded, as though a business transaction had been completed successfully, and turned to leave the chapel. Alara stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, wondering if this was truly what the rest of her life would look like. In the days that followed, Alara tried to understand her new husband, but he was like a locked door with no visible key. He spent most of his hours in his study, buried in papers about the estate, the tenants, and matters of business she was never invited to discuss. At dinner, he spoke only when necessary, his words short and practical. "The soup is good," he said once, the closest thing to a compliment she had received in a week. "Thank you," she replied, hoping it might lead to conversation. It did not. He returned to his food, and silence filled the space between them once again. The servants whispered about him when they thought she could not hear. They said the Duke had once been different, warmer, before something happened that changed him forever. No one spoke of what that something was, and Alara did not ask. She sensed that some doors, even in conversation, were better left closed. Margaret, the housekeeper, became the closest thing Alara had to a friend in those early weeks. She was a stout woman, with kind eyes, and a habit of humming old songs while she worked. One afternoon, as they folded linens together in the sewing room, Margaret spoke gently. "Give him time, my lady," she said. "The Duke was not always like this. He used to laugh. Once. I remember it well." "What What happened to him? Elara asked, unable to hold back her curiosity any longer. Margaret's humming stopped. She glanced toward the door, as though checking for listeners, then lowered her voice. That is not my story to tell, my lady. But know this, he is not cruel. He is simply guarded. There is a difference. Elara held on to those words as the weeks passed, trying to be patient, trying to find the man beneath the armor. She learned the rhythms of the house, the names of every servant, the habits of every room. She oversaw the kitchens, arranged the gardens, and slowly earned the quiet respect of the staff who had once looked at her with suspicion. But Julian remained distant. He left before sunrise and returned after dark, his days consumed by responsibilities he never explained to her. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear him in his study, pacing the floor, muttering to himself about numbers and debts and decisions that weighed heavily on his shoulders. She wanted to knock on his door, to ask if he needed anything, to offer comfort. But something in the silence of the house told her to stay away. One evening, a storm returned to Ashcombe, much like the one that had carried her there. Thunder cracked so loudly that the windows shook, and Elara found herself standing outside Julian's study without meaning to. Through the small gap in the door, she saw him sitting at his desk, staring at a portrait she had never noticed before, hidden behind a curtain during the day. It was a painting of a young woman with golden hair and a gentle smile, faded slightly with age. Julian's hand trembled as he reached toward the frame, and for a moment, Elara saw something she had never seen on his face before. Grief. Deep, unspoken grief. She stepped back quietly before he could notice her, her heart racing with questions she knew she could not ask. Who was the woman in the painting? What had happened to make a duke so cold, so guarded, so afraid of feeling anything at all? That night, Elara returned to her room and sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside. She thought about the vow she had made in that quiet chapel, the promise to stand beside a man who barely acknowledged her presence. She thought about her mother's words, about survival, about learning to live without expecting warmth in return. But somewhere deep inside her, a small and stubborn hope refused to die. Perhaps, she thought, if she was patient enough, kind enough, present enough, the walls around Julian's heart might slowly begin to crack. Perhaps the cold duke she had married might someday become the husband she had once dreamed of, back when dreams were still allowed. She did not know, as she finally drifted to sleep that night, how many more storms would pass before she would learn the truth about the woman in the painting, or how much heartbreak would come before either of them found peace. She only knew that she had entered this marriage with open eyes and a closed heart, determined to protect herself from a man who seemed determined to never let her in. Little did she know, the walls of Ashcombe Manor held far more secrets than she could have imagined, and the storm outside her window was nothing compared to the storm quietly building inside her own heart. Morning came with pale light filtering through heavy curtains, and Elara woke feeling as though she had not slept at all. She dressed quickly, aware that a new day at Ashcombe Manor meant new routines to learn, new expectations to meet, and another day of trying to understand the man she had married. At breakfast, Julian was already seated, reading correspondence with a furrowed brow. He barely looked up when she entered. "Good morning," she said, taking her seat across from him. "Morning," he replied, not lifting his eyes from the paper in his hand. She poured herself tea, watching him from the corner of her eye. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness in his jaw that suggested the letter contained troubling news. She wanted to ask, but she had learned quickly that questions about his business were rarely welcomed. "Is everything well?" she asked anyway, deciding that a little courage might not hurt. Julian finally looked up, his gray eyes studying her for a moment longer than usual. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, though his tone was not unkind. He folded the letter and placed it beside his plate. "How are you settling in?" The question surprised her. It was the first time he had asked about her well-being since her arrival. "I am settling in well, thank you," she said carefully. "The staff have been very kind, Margaret especially." "Margaret is a good woman," Julian said, a small softness entering his voice for the first time. "She has been with this family since before I was born." For a brief moment, Elara felt a flicker of connection, a shared topic that did not feel forced or cold. She wanted to hold on to it, to build upon it, but Julian's attention returned to his letters, and the moment slipped away as quickly as it had arrived. Over the following days, Alara noticed small patterns in her husband's behavior. He avoided the east wing of the manor entirely, the section of the house where, she later learned from a young maid named Grace, the previous Duchess had once kept her private rooms. He never spoke of his mother, who had passed years earlier, nor of any siblings, though portraits of children hung in forgotten hallways, their names never mentioned in conversation. Grace, unlike Margaret, was younger and more prone to gossip, though she always spoke in hushed whispers, glancing over her shoulder, as though the walls themselves might report her words to the Duke. "They say he was engaged once, my lady," Grace confided one afternoon, while helping Alara arrange her hair. "Before you, to a lady named Charlotte Wren. Beautiful she was, if the old paintings are to be believed." Alara's fingers paused over the ribbon she had been holding. What happened to her? Grace's eyes widened slightly, as though realizing she had said too much. "I do not know the whole story, my lady. Only that she left, quite suddenly, and the Duke has not been the same since. Please, do not tell anyone I spoke of this." Alara promised her silence, though the information settled into her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about her husband. A previous engagement, a woman who left. Perhaps that explained the painting, hidden behind the curtain in his study, the grief she had witnessed on his face during the storm. She began to see Julian differently after that conversation. His coldness was not simply the nature of a duke bred for duty and distance. It was armor, built carefully over time to protect a heart that had already been broken once. Understanding this did not make his indifference easier to bear, but it gave her a strange sense of empathy she had not expected to feel. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens to clear her mind, Alara encountered a man she had not met before. He was younger than Julian, with an easy smile and friendly eyes that immediately put her at ease. "You must be the new Duchess," he said, offering a slight bow. "Forgive my intrusion. I am Corwin Ashford, a friend of your husband since our days at university." "Alara," she replied, returning his smile. "It is nice to meet a friend of Julian's. I confess, I know very little about his past." Corwin's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, before he composed himself. "Julian does not share his past easily," he said carefully. "But give him time, my lady. He was not always so guarded. There was a period, years ago, when he was quite different, lighter, happier." "Before Charlotte Wren?" Alara asked, testing the name to see how Corwin would react. His eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "You have heard of her, then?" "Yes, before Charlotte. She was to be his wife, long before you arrived. But circumstances changed, and she chose a different path. Julian took it hard, harder than most people realized." Alara wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what had happened between Julian and this woman from his past, but Corwin seemed to sense her hesitation and offered a reassuring smile instead. "Do not let his silence discourage you, my lady. Beneath that cold exterior, there is still a man capable of warmth. I have seen glimpses of it, even now. Perhaps you will be the one to bring it back to the surface." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended, planting a seed of hope she had not realized she still carried. Perhaps Julian was not simply an unfeeling duke incapable of love. Perhaps he was a man wounded so deeply that he had built walls to protect himself from ever feeling that pain again. That evening, as they sat together at dinner, in another round of comfortable silence, Alara found herself studying Julian more closely than before. She noticed the way his hand tightened slightly around his glass whenever a servant mentioned anything related to weddings or engagements in passing conversation. She noticed how his eyes would occasionally drift toward the east wing of the house, as though pulled by memories he tried desperately to ignore. For the first time since her arrival, she felt something other than fear or resignation toward her circumstances. She felt determination. If Julian Renshaw was a man hiding behind walls built from heartbreak, then perhaps, with patience and understanding, those walls could be dismantled, brick by brick, until the man Corwin remembered could emerge once again. She did not know, as she retired to her chambers that night, that her patience would be tested far beyond what she could imagine, or that the ghosts of Julian's past held more danger than simple heartbreak. She only knew that she had chosen, in that quiet moment at the dinner table, to fight for something more than survival in this marriage. Little did she realize, Choosing to fight for Julian's heart would come at a cost she had not yet begun to understand, and the storm building within the walls of Ashcombe Manor was far from finished. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of rhythm to Alara's days at Ashcombe Manor. She rose early, oversaw the running of the household with growing confidence, and spent her afternoons in the gardens or the library, slowly filling the empty hours that came with being married to a man who rarely spoke more than necessary. Yet beneath this rhythm, something had shifted since her conversation with Corwin Ashford. She no longer saw Julian as simply cold. She saw him as a puzzle waiting to be solved, a man worth understanding rather than merely enduring. She began paying closer attention to the small details of his life. She noticed he took his tea without sugar, always black, always strong. She noticed he preferred silence in the mornings, but seemed slightly more at ease in the evenings, when the pressures of estate business had quieted for the day. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed, just slightly, whenever music drifted through the halls, played by one of the maids who hummed old folk songs while dusting the furniture. One evening, acting on this small observation, Alara asked Grace to teach her a simple tune on the old piano that sat neglected in the drawing room. It took several attempts, her fingers stumbling over unfamiliar keys, but eventually, she managed to play a soft, gentle melody that filled the quiet room with warmth. She did not notice Julian standing in the doorway until she finished the final note. When she turned, she found him watching her with an expression she had not seen before, something between surprise and quiet appreciation. "I did not know you played," he said softly. "I do not really," she admitted, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Grace has been teaching me. I thought the house could use a little more music." Julian stepped further into the room, his eyes lingering on the piano before returning to her face. "My mother used to play," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "This very piano, in fact. I have not heard it played in years." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother voluntarily, without being asked, and Alara sensed the fragility of the moment, like holding a delicate bird that might fly away at the slightest wrong movement. "Would you like to hear another?" she asked gently, hoping to extend this rare thread of connection. Julian hesitated, then nodded, taking a seat in the chair nearest the piano. Alara played the only other tune she knew, her fingers slow and imperfect, but Julian did not seem to mind the mistakes. He watched her with quiet attention, and for a moment, the cold distance between them seemed to soften, just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw beneath the first warmth of spring. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. The silence between them felt different than before, less like emptiness and more like the comfortable quiet shared between two people who did not need words to understand each other. "Thank you," Julian finally said, rising from his chair, "for the music. It has been a long time since this house felt anything like home." He left the room before she could respond, but his words stayed with her long into the night, a small victory in the slow, uncertain war she had chosen to fight for his heart. Encouraged by this small breakthrough, Alara continued her quiet efforts over the following weeks. She learned more songs, arranged fresh flowers from the garden in his study without being asked, and slowly began joining him for evening walks along the estate grounds, something he had never invited but never refused either. During one such walk, as autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet and the sky turned soft shades of orange and pink, Julian spoke more openly than he ever had before. "I was engaged once," he said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on her. "Before you." Her name was Charlotte. Alara's heart quickened, though she kept her expression calm, sensing that any strong reaction might cause him to retreat back into silence. "I have heard the name," she admitted softly. "I did not wish to pry." "She left me for another man," Julian continued, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of old pain. "A wealthy merchant from London, with connections she found more appealing than a duke, burdened by debt and duty. I did not see it coming. I trusted her completely, and she shattered that trust without a second thought." "I am sorry," Alara said quietly, meaning it deeply. "That must have been very painful." Julian finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face as though trying to determine whether her sympathy was genuine or simply expected courtesy. "It was," he admitted. "For a long time, I convinced myself that love was nothing more than a transaction, easily broken when a better offer arrived. I built walls after that, Alara, walls I did not intend to lower for anyone. And yet you are lowering them now, she said gently, at least a little. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since her arrival. Perhaps I am, he admitted. You are patient, Alara, more patient than I deserve, given how I have treated you since your arrival. You have not been cruel, she said honestly, only guarded. There is a difference. Her words echoed Margaret's earlier explanation, and something in Julian's expression shifted, as though he recognized the housekeeper's influence in her understanding. Margaret always did have a gift for seeing the good in people, he said, the smallest hint of warmth coloring his tone. They continued their walk in comfortable silence after that, the weight of his confession settling gently between them, rather than driving them apart. For the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, Alara felt genuine hope that the distance between them might one day close completely, that the marriage born from debt and duty might someday grow into something built on understanding, respect, and perhaps even love. She did not yet know that Charlotte Wren's shadow would return to test that fragile hope, or that Edmund Renshaw, Julian's ambitious cousin, watched their growing closeness with calculating eyes, seeing in it a threat to plans he had been quietly arranging for years. The peace she felt that evening, walking beside her husband beneath the autumn sky, was only the beginning of a much longer, much harder journey, one that would demand more courage and more heartbreak than she could yet imagine. But for now, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the quiet warmth of the moment, unaware of the storm that patience and hope alone would not be enough to weather. Winter arrived slowly at Ashcombe Manor, wrapping the estate in frost and pale morning light. The gardens Alara had once walked through with Julian now lay quiet beneath thin layers of snow, and the warmth that had begun to grow between them seemed, for a time, to deepen rather than fade with the changing season. Julian began joining her for breakfast more often, no longer burying himself immediately in correspondence. Small conversations became easier, lighter, filled with observations about the weather, the staff, or the books she had been reading in the library. It was not a grand transformation, but it was enough to give Alara genuine hope that their marriage might yet become something real. It was during this fragile, hopeful season that Edmund Renshaw arrived at the manor, announced only a day before his carriage rolled up the frozen drive. Edmund was Julian's cousin, a distant relation on his father's side, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a way of speaking that made every compliment sound like a calculation. "Cousin Julian," Edmund said warmly, as he stepped into the entrance hall, shaking snow from his coat. "It has been far too long, and this must be your lovely new Duchess." Alara offered a polite smile, though something about Edmund's presence unsettled her immediately. His eyes lingered a moment too long, his greeting a touch too smooth, like a merchant sizing up a piece of property, rather than a man meeting family. "Edmund," Julian said, his voice noticeably cooler than it had been in recent weeks. "I did not expect you until spring." "Business brought me sooner than planned," Edmund replied smoothly, glancing around the grand hall with an expression Alara could not quite read. "I hope my presence is not an inconvenience." "Of course not," Julian said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "You are welcome to stay as long as necessary." Over dinner that evening, Alara watched the dynamic between the two men closely. Edmund spoke with practiced charm, filling the silence Julian usually left untouched, asking questions about the estate's finances with a curiosity that felt less like genuine interest and more like careful investigation. Julian answered carefully, his guarded nature returning in full force, as though Edmund's presence had rebuilt walls she had spent months slowly dismantling. Later that night, after Edmund had retired to his guest chambers, Alara found Julian standing alone in his study, staring at the fire with a troubled expression. "You do not seem pleased by your cousin's visit," she observed gently, stepping into the room. Julian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Edmund has always wanted what I have," he admitted. "The title, the estate, the responsibilities that come with being a Renshaw. My father favored him for a time, before I was born, when it seemed unlikely my mother would bear a son. Edmund never forgave the shift in fortune when I arrived. Do you think he means harm?" Alara asked, her earlier unease returning with renewed strength. "I do not know," Julian admitted honestly. "Edmund is many things, but he is also patient. He waits for opportunities rather than creating them outright. I have learned to watch him carefully whenever he visits." Alara filed this warning away carefully, resolving to keep her own eyes open during Edmund's stay. Over the following days, she noticed him watching her interactions with Julian with unusual attention, his expression unreadable but calculating. He seemed particularly interested in the moments when she and Julian shared quiet laughter over dinner, or when Julian offered his arm to escort her through the gardens despite the cold. One afternoon, while Julian was occupied with estate matters in the village, Edmund found Alara alone in the library, sitting near the fire with a book she had not truly been reading. "You have made quite an impression on my cousin," Edmund said, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "I confess, I did not expect Julian to warm so quickly to an arranged marriage. He was quite cold after Charlotte left him, if you are aware of that history." "I am aware," Alara said carefully, keeping her tone neutral, despite the discomfort his presence created. "Then you understand how remarkable your progress has been," Edmund continued, his smile widening slightly. "Though I wonder, my lady, if you truly understand what you have taken on. Julian's heart has been broken before. Are you certain you wish to risk breaking it again, should things not work out between you?" The question felt less like genuine concern and more like a subtle threat, though Alara could not immediately determine his intention. "I intend for things to work out," she said firmly. "Julian and I are building something real, slowly, but genuinely." Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly, before his charming smile returned. "Of course, my lady. I only wish the best for my cousin's happiness. Forgive my forwardness. It comes from genuine family concern, nothing more." He left the library shortly after, but the conversation lingered in Alara's mind long after his departure, a quiet warning bell she could not fully silence. Something about Edmund felt wrong, calculated in a way that suggested his concern for Julian's happiness was far less genuine than he claimed. That evening, she mentioned the conversation to Julian, careful to relay Edmund's words accurately without exaggeration. Julian's expression darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening with barely contained frustration. "Edmund has always had a talent for planting doubt," he said quietly. "He did the same before Charlotte left, though I did not understand his involvement until much later. I suspect he encouraged her toward the merchant she eventually married, seeing an opportunity to weaken my position and strengthen his own claim to influence within the family." "You believe he orchestrated your heartbreak?" Alara asked, shocked by the implication. "I cannot prove it," Julian admitted, "but I have my suspicions, and now, watching him take such interest in our marriage, I fear he may be attempting something similar once again." The revelation settled heavily between them, transforming Edmund's visit from an uncomfortable inconvenience into a genuine threat to the fragile happiness they had begun building together. Alara resolved, in that moment, to remain vigilant, refusing to allow Edmund's calculated words to plant seeds of doubt within her own heart, no matter how skillfully he attempted to sow them. Despite this resolve, Edmund's presence continued to create subtle tension throughout the following weeks. He found ways to insert himself into conversations, to offer comments that carried hidden implications, to remind Alara, in careful and indirect ways, of Charlotte Wren's shadow that still lingered over Julian's heart. He spoke of Charlotte's beauty, her charm, the life Julian might have had if circumstances had unfolded differently, always framing his words as innocent nostalgia rather than deliberate manipulation. One evening, during a small gathering Julian hosted for nearby nobility, Alara overheard Edmund speaking quietly with Lord Pembroke, a wealthy landowner known for his connections throughout the region. "The Duchess is a lovely woman," Edmund was saying, his voice pitched just low enough to seem private, though one wonders how long a marriage built on debt and duty can truly last. "Julian's heart has proven fragile before, has it not?" Lord Pembroke chuckled softly, clearly amused rather than concerned. "Marriages of convenience rarely last on affection alone, Edmund. But the estate benefits regardless, does it not? Perhaps that is all that truly matters." "Perhaps," Edmund replied, his eyes drifting toward Alara as though sensing her attention, though he made no acknowledgement of having noticed her. "Though I confess, I worry for my cousin's happiness above all else." Alara moved away before either man could notice her presence, her heart racing with a mixture of anger and unease. Edmund's words, spoken so casually to a man of influence, felt like the careful planting of seeds meant to grow into something far more damaging than simple gossip. She did not mention the overheard conversation to Julian that night, uncertain how to address it without seeming paranoid or accusatory toward a family member he had known his entire life. Instead, she resolved to watch Edmund even more closely, determined to protect the fragile happiness she and Julian had built, no matter what schemes his cousin might be quietly arranging behind polite smiles and careful words. Little did she know, Edmund's true intentions ran far deeper than simple jealousy or family rivalry, and the seeds he had already planted would soon begin to bloom into a crisis that would test the very foundation of her marriage to Julian Renshaw. The scandal broke on a cold morning in early spring, carried into Ashcombe Manor not by a messenger, but by whispers among the servants that quickly reached Alara's ears before Julian had even finished his breakfast. A rumor had spread through the neighboring towns, claiming that Julian Renshaw had accumulated debts far beyond what the estate could manage, and worse, that he had secretly arranged to sell off ancestral land to a rival family in order to cover his losses. Alara found Julian in his study, a crumpled letter in his hand, and an expression of controlled fury on his face. "Someone has been spreading lies," he said before she could even ask, "claiming I intend to sell the northern fields to the Ashworth family. It is not true, not a single word of it, but the damage is already spreading through the county." Who would spread such a rumor? Alara asked, though a cold suspicion had already begun forming in her mind. Julian's jaw tightened. "I do not know for certain, but I have my suspicions. This kind of misinformation requires access to details only someone close to the family would know." Neither of them spoke Edmund's name aloud, but the unspoken accusation hung heavily in the air between them. Alara thought back to the conversation she had overheard weeks earlier, Edmund's careful words to Lord Pembroke about fragile marriages and uncertain futures, and wondered if this rumor was simply the next step in whatever scheme he had been quietly building. The consequences of the rumor spread quickly. Invitations that had once arrived regularly from neighboring estates slowed to a trickle. Merchants who had extended credit to the household began requesting payment more urgently than usual. Even Lord Pembroke, who had seemed amused rather than concerned during their earlier gathering, sent a carefully worded letter expressing his hope that the rumors were unfounded, though the tone carried an unmistakable edge of caution. Alara watched Julian retreat further into himself as the pressure mounted, his guarded nature returning with a vengeance she had not seen since her earliest days at Ashcombe. He spent longer hours locked away in his study, emerging only for brief, tense meals where conversation felt forced and fragile. Determined not to let the progress they had made together crumble under the weight of Edmund's manipulation, Alara made a decision that surprised even herself. She began attending social gatherings without Julian, using her growing relationships within the household staff and neighboring families to quietly counter the rumors herself, speaking honestly and confidently about the strength of the estate's finances and the loyalty she had witnessed in her husband's careful management of Ashcombe's affairs. At a gathering hosted by Lady Pembroke, Alara found herself directly confronted by the rumor when a curious guest asked pointedly about the northern fields. "I can assure you," Alara said calmly, meeting the woman's curious gaze without flinching, "there is no truth to these rumors. My husband has worked tirelessly to protect and strengthen the Ashcombe estate, not diminish it. I have seen his ledgers myself, and the family's finances remain stable and secure." Her confident defense spread through the gathering, and by the end of the evening, several guests had approached her privately, expressing relief and renewed confidence in the Renshaw family's reputation. Word of her efforts eventually reached Julian, carried by Corwin Ashford, who visited the manor specifically to share the news. "Your wife has been quite the advocate for you throughout the county," Corwin told Julian over drinks in the study, unaware that Alara stood just outside the door, having returned home moments earlier. She spoke with such confidence and conviction that even the most skeptical among the local nobility have begun questioning the original rumors. Alara's heart lifted, hoping this news might finally bridge the emotional distance that Edmund's scheming had reintroduced into her marriage. She stepped into the study, expecting gratitude, perhaps even warmth, from the husband she had defended so fiercely. Instead, Julian's expression remained guarded, almost cautious. "You did not need to involve yourself in estate matters," he said, his tone carrying more concern than appreciation. "These situations can be dangerous, Alara. Reputations are fragile things, and involving yourself so publicly could have backfired terribly." "I did it because I believe in you," Alara said, hurt evident in her voice, despite her attempt to remain composed. "I did it because you are my husband, and I will not stand by silently while lies threaten everything you have worked to build." I appreciate the sentiment, Julian said carefully, though his words felt distant rather than warm. But you must understand, Alara, loyalty born from duty is expected. It does not require celebration. The words struck her harder than she expected, revealing that despite the progress they had made, Julian still viewed her actions through the lens of obligation, rather than genuine devotion. He had not yet allowed himself to believe that her defense came from something deeper than the role she had been assigned as his wife. Corwin, sensing the tension, excused himself quietly, leaving Alara and Julian alone, in a silence that felt heavier than any that had come before. Do you truly believe I acted only from duty? Alara asked quietly, unable to hide the pain in her voice. Julian hesitated, his gray eyes searching her face, as though genuinely uncertain of his own answer. I do not know what to believe, he admitted finally. I have been wrong about people's intentions before, Alara. Trusting too easily cost me dearly once. I am simply being cautious. There is a difference between caution and refusing to see what stands directly in front of you, Alara said, her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest. I have given you patience, understanding, and now public loyalty at personal risk. If that is not enough to earn even a moment of genuine trust, then I fear nothing ever will be. She left the study before he could respond, retreating to her chambers with tears she refused to let fall in his presence. For the first time since their conversation during the autumn walk, she felt the full weight of how deeply Julian's past wounds had scarred him, how thoroughly Charlotte's betrayal had convinced him that even genuine devotion could not be trusted without suspicion. That night, alone in her room, Alara began to understand something important about her marriage that she had not fully grasped before. She could offer patience, kindness, loyalty, and love, but she could not force Julian to see her clearly if he remained determined to view every act of devotion through the lens of his past heartbreak. Understanding his pain was one thing, continuing to absorb its consequences indefinitely was another entirely. Meanwhile, Edmund watched the growing tension between the Duke and Duchess with quiet satisfaction from the shadows of his own carefully constructed schemes. The rumor about the northern fields had served its purpose well, not by destroying the estate's finances as intended, but by reintroducing exactly the kind of doubt and distance between Julian and Alara that Edmund had hoped to achieve. If he could not gain the title through direct means, perhaps he could gain influence by ensuring Julian's marriage crumbled under the weight of unresolved suspicion and emotional distance, leaving the Duke isolated and vulnerable to manipulation once again. He did not yet realize that his careful schemes would soon collide with a woman whose patience, though deep, was not infinite, and whose quiet strength would ultimately prove far more formidable than he had anticipated. The weeks following that painful conversation in the study passed in a strange, quiet numbness. Alara continued performing her duties as Duchess with the same grace and diligence she always had, but something inside her had shifted, a quiet withdrawal she could not fully explain even to herself. She no longer waited by the piano hoping Julian would appear in the doorway. She no longer arranged flowers in his study with the same hopeful anticipation. She simply completed her tasks, spoke when necessary, and retreated into a calm distance that mirrored, in many ways, the very coldness that had once defined her husband. Julian noticed the change, though he said nothing about it directly. Their conversations at meals grew shorter again, their evening walks less frequent, until eventually they stopped altogether. The fragile warmth they had built together over the autumn and early winter months seemed to dissolve, replaced by a polite formality that felt, to Alara, worse than the original coldness she had endured upon her arrival. At least then, she had not yet known what genuine connection with him could feel like. Now, having experienced it and lost it again, the silence felt unbearable. Margaret noticed the shift as well, her kind eyes watching Alara with growing concern during their afternoons together in the sewing room. You seem tired, my lady, Margaret said gently one afternoon, setting aside the linens she had been folding, more tired than simple work should cause. I am simply weary, Alara admitted, unable to fully hide the exhaustion in her voice. Weary of trying to reach a man who seems determined to remain unreachable. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. The Duke carries wounds deeper than most realize, she said carefully. But that does not mean you must sacrifice your own happiness indefinitely while waiting for him to heal. What else can I do? Alara asked, genuine confusion coloring her voice. I married him. I made a vow before God and witnesses. Leaving is not a simple option available to a woman in my position. I did not say leave, Margaret clarified gently. I only meant that patience should have limits, my lady. Even the kindest heart can be worn down if it gives endlessly, without receiving anything meaningful in return. Alara considered these words carefully in the days that followed, turning them over in her mind during quiet moments in the garden or the library. She still believed in the man she had glimpsed during their walk beneath the autumn sky, the man who had shared his pain about Charlotte, who had smiled at her music, who had called this cold estate a home for the first time in years. But she was beginning to understand that believing in someone's potential was not the same as being responsible for unlocking it, especially when her efforts continued to be met with suspicion rather than gratitude. The situation reached its breaking point on an evening in late spring, when Alara returned from a visit to her family estate, having traveled there briefly to see her sister Beatrice, who had recently given birth to her first child. She returned to Ashcombe Manor with a lightness in her step, eager to share the joyful news with Julian, hoping the happy occasion might offer a fresh opportunity to rebuild the connection they had lost. Instead, she found Edmund waiting in the entrance hall, his expression carrying a satisfaction that immediately put her on guard. "Ah, the Duchess returns," he said smoothly. "I trust your family as well." "They are, thank you," Alara replied cautiously. "Where is Julian?" "In his study, though I would advise caution before disturbing him," Edmund said, his tone carrying false concern. "He received troubling correspondence while you were away. Something about your family's financial situation, I believe. Debts far more extensive than originally disclosed at the time of your marriage arrangement." Alara's stomach tightened with unease. "That is not possible. My father settled the arrangement honestly." "Perhaps," Edmund said with a shrug that suggested otherwise. Though Julian seemed quite troubled by the letter. "You may wish to speak with him directly, rather than relying on my second-hand account." Alara found Julian in his study, exactly where Edmund had indicated, staring at a letter with an expression she could not fully read. When she entered, he looked up, his gray eyes carrying an emotion she had not seen from him before, something closer to disappointment than anger. "Julian, what is this about my family's finances?" she asked directly, refusing to let uncertainty control the conversation. He handed her the letter without a word. It claimed, in careful and convincing detail, that her father had concealed debts far beyond what had been disclosed during the marriage negotiations, suggesting that the entire arrangement had been built upon dishonesty from the very beginning. Alara read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly as anger and confusion mixed within her. "This is not true," she said firmly. "My father may have many faults, but he would not deceive you in this manner. Where did this letter come from?" "It arrived unsigned," Julian said quietly. "But the details are specific enough to suggest genuine knowledge of your family's private affairs." "And you believe it?" Alara asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "After everything? After the loyalty I have shown you, the patience, the defense I offered during the rumors about the northern fields, you would believe an anonymous letter over my word?" Julian hesitated, and that hesitation told Alara everything she needed to know. "I do not know what to believe anymore," he admitted. "I have been deceived before, Alara. I cannot simply dismiss concerns without investigation." "Then investigate," Alara said, her voice steady, despite the heartbreak building within her. "Write to my father directly. Demand the truth. But do not sit here, doubting me based on an unsigned letter, delivered conveniently while I was away, without even considering who might benefit from planting such doubt between us." She glanced meaningfully toward the door, where she suspected Edmund still lingered somewhere within earshot, but Julian did not seem to grasp her implication, too consumed by his own resurfacing fears of betrayal to see the manipulation unfolding directly in front of him. "I need time to consider this properly," Julian said finally, his voice carrying a distance that felt colder than anything she had experienced since her earliest days at Ashcombe. Alara left the study that night with a clarity she had not expected to find. She had spent months offering patience, understanding, loyalty, and love to a man who, despite occasional glimpses of warmth, remained fundamentally unable to trust her completely, always searching for reasons to doubt rather than reasons to believe. She had defended him publicly, cared for his household diligently, and shared vulnerable moments that she had believed were building something real between them. Yet at the first sign of manufactured doubt, he retreated immediately into suspicion, unwilling to extend her even the basic courtesy of trust that any genuine partnership required. She spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling of her chambers, finally allowing herself to acknowledge a truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She could not continue pouring herself into a marriage that offered nothing meaningful in return, waiting indefinitely for a healing that might never come, absorbing suspicion and doubt while receiving little warmth or trust to sustain her own heart through the process. The next morning, she wrote to her family, requesting a visit home under the pretense of continuing to support her sister during the early months of motherhood. She did not mention the letter about supposed debts, nor did she reveal the depth of heartbreak that had prompted her decision. She simply packed a modest bag, informed Margaret quietly of her plans, and prepared to leave Ashcombe Manor for what she suspected, deep in her heart, might become a permanent departure rather than a temporary visit. Margaret's eyes filled with quiet understanding as she helped Alara prepare, saying nothing to discourage the decision, only offering a gentle embrace before Alara stepped into the waiting carriage. "Will you tell him I have gone?" Alara asked softly. "He will notice soon enough, my lady," Margaret replied, her voice carrying both sadness and respect for the decision Alara had made. Some truths do not require announcement. They simply become clear through absence. Alara did not leave a dramatic note filled with accusations or pleas for reconsideration. She left only a simple, folded letter on the desk in Julian's study, stating plainly that she would not be returning to Ashcombe Manor, along with her wedding ring, placed carefully beside it. She had not begged him to understand her decision, nor had she demanded an apology for the doubt he had shown her. She had simply chosen, quietly and with dignity, to remove herself from a situation that no longer served her own well-being, regardless of how much she still cared for the man she was leaving behind. As the carriage carried her away from Ashcombe Manor, retracing the same road that had brought her there months earlier during a violent storm, Alara felt a strange mixture of grief and relief settle over her heart. She did not know what the future held, whether Julian would eventually understand the true nature of Edmund's manipulation, or whether their marriage could ever be salvaged from the damage caused by doubt and unresolved heartbreak. She only knew that she had finally chosen herself, after months of choosing patience, understanding, and hope for a man who had not yet learned how to choose her in return. She did not look back as the manor disappeared behind the hills, though she could not have known, in that quiet moment of departure, just how quickly and how completely Julian's world would begin to unravel once he discovered the depth of what he had lost. Julian did not notice Alara's absence immediately. He spent the following 2 days locked away in his study, consumed by the anonymous letter and the doubts it had reignited, barely registering the unusual quiet that had settled over the household. It was only on the third morning, when he descended for breakfast and found the table set for one, that a flicker of unease began to stir within him. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked the servant, clearing the sideboard, expecting a simple answer about a late morning or a headache requiring rest. "She departed 2 days ago, Your Grace," the servant replied carefully. "For her family's estate, I believe." Mrs. Margaret assisted with her preparations. Julian frowned, an uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest. Alara had not mentioned any plans to visit her family, not during their tense conversation about the letter, not in any conversation since her return from visiting her sister. He finished his breakfast in silence, telling himself there was likely a reasonable explanation, that she had simply needed time to process her frustration with him, and would return within a matter of days once tempers had cooled. But as he made his way toward his study to begin the day's work, something compelled him to stop by the room instead, to look for any indication of when she might return. It was there, on his desk, exactly where she had left it, that he found the folded letter and the wedding ring resting quietly beside it. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, reading her words once, then twice, then a third time, as though repetition might somehow change their meaning. "Julian, I have given this marriage everything I have to offer. Patience, when you needed time. Understanding, when your past made trust difficult. Loyalty, even when it cost me publicly. I do not regret any of it, because I believed, and still believe, that beneath your guarded heart exists a man capable of genuine love and trust. But I cannot continue giving indefinitely, while receiving only suspicion in return." When faced with an anonymous letter designed to plant doubt, you chose distrust over the loyalty I had already proven, time and again. I understand your past has taught you caution. I do not understand why that caution must always be directed at me, rather than at those who clearly wish to see us fail. I am not leaving in anger, nor am I leaving to punish you. I am leaving because I deserve a partnership built on mutual trust, not one where I must constantly prove my worth against shadows from your past that I did not create and cannot control. I wish you well, Julian. I hope you find the peace and trust you deserve, even if I am not the one who helps you find it. Elara. He read the letter a fourth time, and then a fifth, sitting slowly into his chair as the full weight of her words settled over him. She had not written in anger or accusation, which somehow made the letter's impact far more devastating than any furious confrontation could have been. Her calm, dignified departure revealed a strength and clarity he had not fully appreciated during their months together, a quiet resolve that made her absence feel like the removal of something essential from the very foundation of the house. He sat alone in his study for hours that day, staring at the empty piano through the open door of the adjoining drawing room, remembering the soft melody she had played months earlier, the first moment he had felt this cold house begin to resemble something like home. He thought of the autumn walk when he had confessed the truth about Charlotte, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show for the first time in years, and how Elara had responded not with judgment, but with genuine empathy and patience. He thought, too, of the anonymous letter about her family's supposed debts, and for the first time, he allowed himself to seriously consider who might have benefited from delivering such information at precisely the moment it would cause maximum damage to his marriage. Rising abruptly from his chair, Julian made his way to Edmund's guest chambers, finding his cousin calmly reading by the fire, an expression of practiced innocence settling over his features as Julian entered without knocking. "Cousin, is something troubling you?" Edmund asked smoothly, setting aside his book. "The letter about Elara's family," Julian said directly, watching Edmund's face carefully for any flicker of guilt. "Where did it come from?" "I could not say," Edmund replied, his tone remaining perfectly composed. "It arrived unsigned, as I understand. Troubling, is it not, to receive such information anonymously?" "Troubling indeed," Julian said, his voice growing colder with each word. "Almost as troubling as the rumor about the northern fields, which also arrived without a clear source, precisely when Elara and I had begun rebuilding trust after months of difficulty." Edmund's composure flickered, just slightly, before he recovered his charming smile. "Surely you do not suspect me of orchestrating such things, Julian. I have only ever wished for your happiness." "Have you?" Julian asked, stepping closer, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that Edmund had rarely encountered from his usually guarded cousin. "Because it seems, upon reflection, that every crisis threatening my marriage has arrived conveniently timed to your visits, and always seems to serve your interests far more than mine. You are grieving her absence and searching for someone to blame," Edmund said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "I understand the impulse, but accusing family without evidence is beneath you, Julian." "Perhaps," Julian said, stepping back slightly. "Or perhaps I have finally learned to see clearly what should have been obvious months ago. Regardless, Edmund, I think it best if you conclude your visit sooner than planned. Return home. We will discuss this further, once I have gathered proper evidence, and I promise you, I intend to gather it thoroughly." Edmund left within the day, his charming mask cracking further with each passing hour, though he maintained his innocence until the very moment his carriage departed down the frozen drive. Julian watched him leave from the window of his study, a cold certainty settling over him that his suspicions, though not yet fully proven, were far closer to the truth than Edmund's protests suggested. But proving Edmund's manipulation, even if successful, would not undo the damage already done. Elara was gone, and the silence she left behind felt louder than any argument or confrontation could have been. Julian found himself noticing her absence in 1,000 small ways throughout the following days. The flowers that no longer appeared fresh in his study each morning. The piano that sat untouched and silent in the drawing room. The quiet efficiency of the household that had, he realized only now, been carefully maintained by her attention, rather than simply continuing on its own. He asked Margaret about the household arrangements one evening, curious how such details had been managed so seamlessly during Elara's months at Ashcombe. "The Duchess arranged everything, Your Grace," Margaret said carefully, her tone carrying a hint of quiet reproach beneath her professional composure. "The schedules for the staff, the menus, the maintenance of the gardens, even the careful management of household expenses that allowed us to weather the recent rumors about the estate's finances, without genuine hardship. She did all of this quietly, without seeking recognition, because she believed it was simply part of caring for this household and everyone within it." Julian absorbed this information slowly, realizing how much he had taken for granted during the months of Alara's presence, how thoroughly he had failed to acknowledge the genuine value and care she had brought to every aspect of life at Ashcombe Manor. He had focused so intensely on protecting himself from potential heartbreak that he had failed to recognize the quiet, steady love being offered to him each and every day, in 1,000 small gestures he had barely noticed, until their absence made the void impossible to ignore. "Why did no one tell me how much she managed?" Julian asked quietly, more to himself than to Margaret. "Would you have listened, Your Grace?" Margaret asked gently, though her question carried the weight of genuine concern rather than criticism. "You spent so many months guarding your heart against potential pain that you failed to notice the woman quietly building a genuine home around you, brick by brick, without ever once asking for recognition or reward." Her words settled deep into Julian's chest, alongside the growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake, one that might not be easily corrected, given how thoroughly he had failed to protect and value the trust Alara had extended to him, despite every obstacle placed in their path. That night, alone in his study once again, Julian finally allowed himself to fully confront the truth he had been avoiding for months. He had not simply been cautious with his heart after Charlotte's betrayal. He had been so consumed by fear of repeating past pain that he had failed to recognize genuine love when it was offered to him freely and consistently, choosing instead to interpret every act of devotion through the lens of suspicion rather than gratitude. He thought of Alara's calm departure, her dignified refusal to beg or argue for a marriage that had failed to offer her the basic respect and trust she deserved. He thought of her words in the letter, the quiet strength beneath every carefully chosen phrase, and understood, with growing certainty, that winning back her trust would require far more than simple apologies or promises of change. It would require proving, through consistent action rather than empty words, that he had genuinely learned to see her clearly, to trust her completely, and to offer the same patience and understanding she had extended to him throughout every difficult month of their marriage. The question remained, as Julian sat alone in the silence of his study that night, whether Alara would ever be willing to give him the opportunity to prove such genuine change, or whether her departure marked not simply a temporary separation, but the permanent end of whatever fragile connection they had managed to build together during their brief months as husband and wife. Julian spent the following weeks gathering the evidence he needed, determined to prove what he now believed with complete certainty regarding Edmund's involvement in the manufactured crises that had damaged his marriage. He wrote to Lord Pembroke directly, asking pointed questions about the conversation Edmund had shared with him at the gathering months earlier. He hired an investigator to trace the source of both the Northern Fields rumor and the anonymous letter about Alara's family debts, following the trail carefully through servants and merchants who had unknowingly assisted in spreading the false information. The evidence, once gathered, proved overwhelming. Edmund had indeed orchestrated both crises, hoping to create enough distance and distrust between Julian and Alara that the marriage would eventually collapse under its own weight, leaving Julian isolated and vulnerable to Edmund's continued influence over family affairs. He had even, the investigator discovered, contacted Alara's father directly under a false pretense, fabricating the very debts he later claimed existed in his anonymous letter. Armed with this proof, Julian confronted Edmund formally, presenting the evidence before witnesses from the extended family who had gathered to address the matter. Edmund's careful composure finally crumbled completely under the weight of undeniable proof, and he was formally removed from any future claim or involvement in Ashcombe's affairs, his reputation among the family and county destroyed by his own manipulative ambitions. But proving Edmund's guilt, while satisfying in its own right, did nothing to heal the deeper wound Julian had created through his own failure to trust his wife completely, regardless of the schemes being quietly orchestrated against them. He understood this clearly as he prepared to travel to Alara's family estate, uncertain of the reception that awaited him after months of silence following her departure. The journey felt longer than he remembered, each mile bringing with it growing uncertainty about whether Alara would even agree to see him. let alone consider forgiving the doubt he had shown her during their final conversation before her departure. He arrived at her family's modest estate on a mild afternoon, the contrast to Ashcombe Manor's grand, imposing architecture immediately striking him as he approached the smaller, warmer-looking home. Alara's father greeted him with cautious politeness, clearly aware of the tension that had led to his daughter's return home, though he said little beyond confirming that Alara was currently in the garden with her sister and newborn niece. Julian found her there, sitting on a simple wooden bench beneath a blooming tree, holding her infant niece while her sister Beatrice sat nearby, laughing softly at something Alara had said. She looked different than he remembered, not sadder or diminished by their separation, but somehow lighter, more at ease, as though the weight of trying to earn trust from an unwilling heart had finally lifted from her shoulders. She noticed him approaching before he could announce himself, and her expression shifted immediately into careful composure, the warmth she had shown moments earlier toward her niece, replaced by a guarded neutrality that struck Julian as painfully familiar, a mirror of the very distance he had shown her throughout their marriage. "Julian," she said calmly, handing the sleeping infant back to Beatrice, who quietly excused herself, sensing the need for privacy despite her obvious curiosity. "I did not expect you to travel all this way." "I needed to see you," Julian said, his carefully prepared words suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of her calm, measured presence. "To tell you that I have discovered the truth about Edmund's involvement in the rumors, and the letter about your family's debts." "I suspected as much," Alara said evenly. "Though I confess, I am somewhat surprised it took formal evidence to convince you, rather than simple trust in my word." Her words carried no bitterness, only a quiet, honest observation that struck Julian more deeply than any accusation could have. "You are right to point that out," he admitted. "I should have trusted you immediately, without requiring proof of Edmund's manipulation. That failure rests entirely with me, not with any deception on your part." Alara studied him for a long moment, her expression giving little away. "Why have you come, Julian? To inform me of Edmund's guilt, or for some other reason?" "I have come to ask for the chance to prove that I have genuinely changed," Julian said, his voice carrying an earnestness she had rarely heard from him during their months together. "Not through words alone, but through actions, over whatever time you require to believe them genuine." "And if I am no longer certain I wish to return to a marriage built on such difficult foundations?" Alara asked, her voice steady, despite the vulnerability the question revealed. Julian nodded slowly, having anticipated this possibility during his long journey. "Then I will respect that decision, however painful it might be for me personally. I do not believe I have the right to demand your forgiveness, or your return, simply because I have finally recognized my own failures. I only ask for the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change, whether that leads to reconciliation, or simply to your own peace of mind, regarding the man you once married." His humility surprised her, a marked departure from the guarded, defensive man she had left behind at Ashcombe Manor months earlier. She had expected apologies, perhaps even desperate pleas for reconsideration, but not this quiet, patient acceptance of whatever outcome she chose to pursue. "I need time, Julian," she said finally. "Time to consider whether the trust and warmth we built together during those better months was genuine enough to survive rebuilding, or whether it was simply a fragile illusion that crumbled too easily under pressure." "Take whatever time you need," Julian replied. "I will not pressure you, nor will I return uninvited to disturb your peace. But know that I remain committed to proving, through patient and consistent action, that I have genuinely learned from the pain I caused you." He left that afternoon without pushing further, honoring her request for space, despite every instinct urging him to fight harder for immediate reconciliation. As his carriage disappeared down the road leading away from her family's estate, Alara remained in the garden long after he had gone, turning over his words carefully in her mind, trying to determine whether the changed man standing before her today represented genuine growth, or simply a temporary reaction to guilt and loss. Margaret's earlier words echoed in her memory. Even the kindest heart can be worn down if it gives endlessly, without receiving anything meaningful in return. She had given endlessly during their marriage, and she was not yet certain she possessed the strength to risk giving so completely again, even if Julian's recent humility suggested genuine transformation rather than temporary desperation. Yet beneath her careful hesitation, a small, stubborn hope remained alive, much as it had during those difficult early months at Ashcombe Manor. Perhaps, she allowed herself to consider. Genuine change was possible, even for a man as guarded and wounded as Julian Renshaw. Perhaps the calm strength she had discovered within herself during their separation could serve not only to protect her heart, but also to guide her toward a wiser, more equal partnership, should she eventually choose to give their marriage another chance. She did not yet know how long that consideration would take, nor whether Julian's patience and consistent effort would prove sufficient to rebuild what his earlier doubt had damaged so severely. She only knew that for the first time in her marriage, the choice rested entirely in her own hands, free from desperation or fear. Guided instead by clarity and genuine self-respect she had fought hard to reclaim during her months away from Ashcombe Manor. 3 months passed before Alara made her decision, 3 months during which Julian kept his word completely, never once appearing uninvited at her family's estate, never sending letters filled with pressure or desperate pleading. Instead, he wrote occasionally, brief and honest letters describing changes he had made at Ashcombe Manor. The formal removal of Edmund from any family influence, the new transparency he had begun practicing with the household staff regarding estate finances, and small, genuine reflections on lessons he had learned about trust and vulnerability during their months apart. He did not ask her to return in any of these letters. He simply shared his continued growth honestly, allowing her the space to observe his consistency from a distance, without the pressure of immediate expectation clouding her judgment. Margaret wrote as well, her letters filled with careful observations about genuine changes she had witnessed in Julian's daily behavior, changes that seemed to extend beyond simple guilt or temporary desperation, into something more permanent and deeply rooted. "He asks about you often, my lady," Margaret wrote in one such letter, "though he never asks me to relay messages or pressure you toward any particular decision. He simply wishes to know that you are well and at peace, wherever your heart eventually leads you." These small, consistent gestures gradually softened the careful walls Alara had built around her own heart during her months of separation. She found herself, almost against her own expectations, beginning to genuinely hope for reconciliation, though she remained determined not to rush back into old patterns that had caused her such pain during their earlier months together. She wrote to Julian eventually, requesting a meeting at Ashcombe Manor itself, wanting to observe firsthand whether the changes described in his letters and Margaret's observations reflected genuine transformation within the walls where their original difficulties had unfolded. Julian welcomed her return with careful restraint, resisting the urge toward grand gestures or emotional declarations that might feel excessive or insincere, given the delicate nature of their reconciliation. Instead, he simply showed her, through quiet daily actions, exactly how thoroughly he had absorbed the lessons of their painful separation. He asked her opinion genuinely on estate matters he had previously kept entirely to himself, valuing her insight rather than dismissing her involvement as unnecessary interference. He shared vulnerabilities more openly, discussing his ongoing struggles with trust honestly, rather than hiding behind guarded silence. He made time for their evening walks once again, not as an occasional gesture, but as a consistent, cherished part of each day, regardless of how demanding his estate responsibilities became. Slowly, over the following weeks, Alara began to trust the genuine nature of his transformation, recognizing the difference between temporary guilt-driven change and authentic, sustained growth built on genuine self-reflection and accountability. "I am not asking you to forget what happened," Julian said one evening, as they walked together through the gardens where their earlier connection had first begun to flourish. "I am only asking for the opportunity to build something stronger from the lessons we have both learned through this difficult experience." "I know," Alara replied softly, taking his offered hand for the first time since her return. "I am not the same woman who first arrived at this estate months ago, frightened and uncertain. I have learned my own strength through this experience, Julian, and I intend to bring that strength into whatever future we build together, rather than losing myself again in patient waiting alone." "I would not want it any other way," Julian said, genuine warmth filling his voice as he looked at her with an openness that had been entirely absent during their earliest months together. "You deserve a partner who sees you clearly, who trusts you completely, and who values your strength rather than simply expecting patient endurance in return for occasional moments of connection." Their reconciliation, when it finally became complete, felt entirely different from the fragile hope that had characterized their earlier months of marriage. This time, their connection rested on mutual respect, genuine trust, and equal partnership, rather than one partner's patient hope carrying the weight of the entire relationship, while the other remained guarded and distant. Word of Edmund's exposed manipulation and formal removal from family influence spread throughout the county, restoring the Renshaw family's reputation more completely than any public defense could have accomplished. Julian's genuine transformation, witnessed by servants, neighbors, and family alike, became a quiet testament to the possibility of authentic change, even for hearts as deeply guarded as his had once been. Years later, when their own children played in the gardens where Julian and Alara had first begun rebuilding trust after Edmund's schemes nearly destroyed their marriage, Margaret would often tell the story to young members of the household staff, a gentle reminder that genuine love required more than patient hope alone. It required honesty, accountability, and the courage to choose trust over fear, even after painful betrayals threatened to make such trust feel impossible. Alara never regretted her decision to leave Ashcombe Manor during those difficult months, understanding clearly that her departure, rather than destroying her marriage permanently, had ultimately created the necessary space for genuine transformation to occur. She had not begged Julian to change, nor had she demanded promises she could not verify through consistent action. She had simply chosen herself, with quiet dignity and calm strength, trusting that whatever future awaited her, whether alongside Julian or entirely separate from him, would be built on her own genuine self-respect, rather than desperate hope alone. That choice, more than any single moment of reconciliation or forgiveness, became the true foundation of the lasting happiness she eventually found within her marriage, a happiness built not on one partner's endless patience, but on mutual growth, genuine trust, and the courage both she and Julian ultimately found to choose each other completely, without fear or hesitation clouding their commitment to one another. The storm that had once carried her toward an uncertain future at Ashcombe Manor had long since passed, replaced by the quiet, steady warmth of a home built genuinely, brick by brick, on foundations far stronger than either of them could have imagined during those first cold, guarded months of their arranged marriage. 5 years after Edmund's schemes had nearly destroyed their marriage, a new challenge arrived at Ashcombe Manor, one that would test the genuine strength of the partnership Julian and Alara had built together in the years since her return. A severe drought struck the region during the summer months, threatening the harvest that supported not only the Renshaw family's finances, but also the livelihoods of every tenant farmer working the estate's lands. Julian, in the early years of their marriage, would have retreated into his study alone, wrestling with the crisis privately, while shutting Alara out of decisions he once considered solely his own responsibility. Instead, he called her into his study on the very first evening reports of failing crops reached him, spreading maps and ledgers across the desk between them. "I need your judgment on this," he said simply, without hesitation or reluctance. "The tenant families closest to the eastern boundary will suffer most severely if we cannot find a solution quickly. What do you think we should do?" Alara studied the maps carefully, drawing on years of experience managing the household and observing the rhythms of estate life. "We should open the old reservoir near the northern fields," she suggested. "It has not been used in years, but Margaret once mentioned it was built by your grandfather, specifically for situations like this. If we can restore the channels, it may provide enough water to save at least the eastern crops." Julian nodded thoughtfully, genuinely weighing her suggestion, rather than simply humoring her involvement. "I had forgotten about the reservoir entirely. Let us investigate together tomorrow morning." Their partnership, tested by this new crisis, revealed just how thoroughly their marriage had transformed since those early, painful months of doubt and distance. They worked side by side throughout the following weeks, restoring the old reservoir, coordinating with tenant farmers, and finding creative solutions to distribute the limited water resources fairly among the families who depended on the estate for their survival. Corwin Ashford, visiting during the height of the crisis, remarked with genuine admiration on the change he witnessed between the couple. "I remember when you barely spoke to each other at dinner," he told Julian one evening, watching Alara direct several tenant farmers toward the newly restored water channels with calm, confident authority. "Now you cannot seem to make a decision without her input. It is remarkable, the transformation these years have brought." "She saved this marriage," Julian said simply, watching his wife with quiet pride and affection. "Not by staying and enduring my failures indefinitely, but by having the courage to leave when I failed to offer her the trust and respect she deserved. That courage taught me more about genuine partnership than years of comfortable, guarded marriage ever could have. The drought eventually broke, and the harvest, though diminished, proved sufficient to sustain the estate and its tenant families through the following winter, thanks largely to the collaborative efforts Julian and Alara had coordinated together. Their success during the crisis further strengthened their reputation throughout the county, transforming Ashcombe Manor from an estate once threatened by scandal and rumor into one respected for its resilience, fairness, and the genuine partnership between its Duke and Duchess. As the years continued to pass, Alara often reflected on the painful months that had once nearly ended her marriage entirely, recognizing clearly how that difficult period had ultimately become the foundation for something far stronger and more genuine than the fragile hope she had carried during her earliest days at Ashcombe Manor. She had learned that love required more than patience and understanding alone. It required mutual respect, honest communication, and the courage to protect her own dignity, even when doing so felt frightening and uncertain. Julian, for his part, never forgot the lesson her departure had taught him, carrying it forward not only within his marriage, but throughout his broader responsibilities as Duke of Ashcombe. He became known throughout the county not simply as a capable and fair landowner, but as a man whose genuine transformation from guarded coldness to open, trusting partnership offered quiet inspiration to others facing similar struggles within their own relationships and families. Their story, quietly shared among the household staff, and eventually, throughout the wider community, became a gentle reminder that even the most guarded hearts could learn genuine trust, provided they received not endless, silent patience, but honest accountability, paired with the courage to choose growth over fear. Alara never regretted the quiet strength she had found within herself during those difficult months of separation, understanding that her willingness to leave, rather than beg for a love that was not yet being genuinely offered, had ultimately created space for something far more valuable than the fragile hope she had carried during her earliest days as Duchess. She had not needed to beg Julian to stay, to change, or to trust her completely. She had simply needed to trust herself enough to walk away, allowing him the space to discover, on his own terms and through his own genuine effort, the depth of what he stood to lose. That quiet act of self-respect, more than any dramatic confrontation or desperate plea, had ultimately become the very foundation upon which their lasting happiness was built, a happiness neither of them had believed possible during those cold, guarded early months, when duty alone seemed destined to define the entirety of their marriage. The gardens of Ashcombe Manor, once witness to Julian's careful confession about Charlotte Wren, and the painful doubts that had nearly destroyed his second chance at love, eventually became a place of genuine joy and laughter, filled with the sounds of their children playing beneath the very trees where their fragile early connection had first begun to grow. And whenever Julian looked out from his study window, watching Alara move confidently through the estate she had once nearly left forever, he felt a deep and abiding gratitude for the quiet courage that had taught him, more than any words ever could, the true meaning of trust, respect, and genuine, lasting love.